The workshop smelled of oil and old wood, the scent of 50 years of careful work. Robert Mitchell stood at his bench in Arlington, Virginia, surrounded by blueprints that had helped put men on the moon. His hands steady despite 78 years folded a theodolite into its leather case. The instrument was older than most people's marriages. He had carried it to Kennedy Space Center in 1969 when his hair was black and the impossible seemed routine. On the wall, a photograph hung in a simple frame. Two young men, caps and gowns, MIT graduation, 1968. The week Apollo 8 circled the moon, Bob Mitchell and James Whitfield, 22 years old, convinced they would change everything. Bob had gone to NASA. James had gone to Oxford to study dead civilizations. They had promised to stay in touch. Promises are easy when you are young. Bob placed the photograph carefully between layers of foam in his travel bag. His phone buzzed. David, his son. The text read, "Dad, please reconsider. This is not healthy. You are 78 years old." Bob typed back with one finger, "I was 23 when we went to the moon. Age is just a number on a calendar." He did not send it. Instead, he wrote, "I will call you from Cairo." The flight to Egypt was 13 hours of uncomfortable seats and recycled air. Bob slept poorly, his mind turning over the problem like an engine that would not quite start. The Smithsonian had been clear. The Egyptian government wanted an independent assessment of the scanned pyramids data. 7 years after the Muon tomography had revealed a massive void inside the Great Pyramid, the international community was still arguing. The Chinese team said one thing, the Europeans said another. The Egyptians wanted an American engineer with credentials beyond question. They wanted someone who had been there when America built the impossible. Bob understood. They did not want youth and enthusiasm. They wanted authority. They wanted someone who remembered when engineering meant slide rules and midnight oil, and getting it right because lives depended on it. They wanted someone from the generation that had looked at the moon and said, "We will go there," and then actually went. He was possibly the last man alive who fit that description and could still climb stairs. Cairo hit him like a wall of heat and noise when he stepped off the plane. The airport was chaos in 3 languages. Bob moved through it with the patience of a man who had survived federal bureaucracy for 30 years. His luggage was lost, then found. His visa was questioned, then approved. By the time he reached the taxi stand, the sun was setting and his shirt was soaked through. The driver spoke minimal English, but knew the route. They drove west through traffic that had no apparent rules toward the desert where the pyramids waited. Bob watched the city give way to sand and stone. The Nile, thick and brown, moved with ancient patience beside the road. Then he saw them. 3 pyramids dark against the dying light. Even from miles away, they dominated everything. Bob had seen photographs his entire life. Documentaries, textbooks, tourist snapshots. None of it prepared him for the physical reality. The sheer mass of them. The way they seemed to compress the air to bend the light around their edges. The taxi stopped at a compound near the Giza Plateau. Low buildings, prefabricated research structures, satellite dishes. A temporary city built to study a permanent one. Bob paid the driver and stood with his bag feeling the weight of 13 hours in the air and 78 years on Earth. A man walked toward him across the compound, tall, thin, white hair catching the last of the daylight, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve energy. Bob knew him instantly, despite 32 years. James Whitfield stopped 3 feet away. His face was lined like a map of everywhere he had been. His eyes were the same bright and curious the eyes of the young man in the MIT photograph. They looked at each other. "You look old, Bobby," James said. "So do you," Bob replied. "At least I have an excuse. I actually worked." James laughed, a sound like rusty machinery coming back to life. "Wait until you see their work." They embraced briefly, awkwardly, in the way of men who had once been close and then had let continents and decades come between them. Bob smelled dust and old books on James's shirt. James probably smelled jet fuel and coffee on his. 32 years, James said, stepping back. "Not since Margaret's funeral." Bob nodded. The memory was sharp. Rain in Arlington. Margaret's colleagues from the library. David, 22 years old, holding Bob's arm because Bob could not quite stand alone. James had flown from Cairo, stayed 2 days, flown back. They had barely spoken. "I should have visited," Bob said. "You were busy putting satellites in orbit," James said. "I was busy digging in the sand. We both had our work." And now the work brought us back together, James smiled. The pyramid has a way of doing that. Come, I will show you where you will sleep. Tomorrow we begin measurements, but tonight you rest. You look like you need it. The quarters were small but clean. A bed, a desk, a window that looked toward the pyramids. Bob unpacked his theodolite, his notebooks, his slide rule in its worn leather sleeve. Tools from another era. He had been offered modern equipment, laser scanners, computer-assisted measurement systems. He had declined. If he was going to assess the work of ancient engineers, he would use tools they might have understood. Precision instruments, yes, but analog. Human scale. No digital readouts, no satellite corrections. Just glass and metal in the human eye. He sat on the bed and called David. The connection was poor, crackling with distance. "Dad," David's voice said, compressed and digital. "You made it." "I made it," Bob confirmed. "How do you feel?" "Like I am 78 years old and just flew halfway around the world." "This is insane. You should be home. You should be resting." Bob looked out the window. The pyramids were black shapes against stars. "I have been resting for 4 years since your mother died." "Rest is overrated." Silence on the line. Then David said, "Mom would have wanted you to be safe." "Your mother understood me. She knew I was never safe. I worked on rockets, David, controlled explosions. She married me anyway." "That was different. You were young." "I am still the same person." "No," David said quietly, "you are not. None of us are." Bob wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was catching up to him. "I will call you tomorrow, after the first measurements." "Dad, I love you. Please be careful." "I love you too, son." He ended the call and lay back on the bed without undressing. The ceiling was water-stained and cracked. Somewhere in the compound, a generator hummed. Bob closed his eyes and was instantly asleep. He dreamed of the moon. Not the moon as he had seen it in photographs, but the moon as it had appeared on the screens at Kennedy Space Center in 1969. Grainy black and white, impossibly distant. Armstrong's boot touching the surface. Bob had been 23 years old, standing in a room full of engineers twice his age, all of them watching the impossible become real. They had done that, his generation. With computers less powerful than a modern phone, with slide rules and blueprints, in sheer stubborn, well, they had put human beings on another world. What could ancient Egyptians have done with the same will, the same focus, the same refusal to accept limitations? He woke before dawn. His body ached in ways it had not ached in years. Flying was hard on old bones. He dressed slowly, carefully, the way he did everything now. There was no rush. Rushing was for young men. Old men moved with deliberation, or they did not move at all. James was waiting outside with coffee in paper cups. They walked together across the compound as the sky turned from black to gray to pale blue. The pyramids emerged from darkness like ships rising from deep water. "How long have you been here?" Bob asked. "In Egypt, I mean. Continuously." 45 years, James said. "I arrived in 1979. I was 31. I thought I would stay 5 years, write my dissertation, go back to Oxford. But the pyramid would not let me leave. Buildings do not have agency. This one does. You will see." They reached the edge of the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid rose before them, 13 acres of base, 481 feet of height, 2,300,000 blocks of stone. The morning light turned the limestone gold. In the distance, Cairo sprawled toward the horizon, modern and chaotic. But here, for this moment, they could have been standing in 2500 BCE, watching the last blocks being placed. "Where do we start?" Bob asked. James handed him a folder. Inside were survey documents, copies of measurements going back to Flinders Petrie in the 1880s. "We start where everyone starts, the base, the foundation. If the foundation is not precise, nothing else matters." Bob nodded. This he understood. At NASA, they had spent months leveling the launch platforms at Kennedy Space Center. Fractions of inches mattered when you were balancing a 300-foot rocket on a thrust plume. If the platform was not level, the rocket would not go straight. He unpacked his theodolite. The brass gleamed in the morning light. He had bought it in 1968 secondhand from a retiring surveyor. It had measured the foundations of Launch Complex 39, the platforms that held the Saturn V rockets. It had been there for Apollo 11, Apollo 13 every mission. He had kept it when he retired when NASA offered him new equipment, digital systems, laser precision. He had kept it because it had never lied to him. James watched as Bob set up the tripod, leveled the instrument with a practiced hand. You are really going to do this manually? They have laser scanning equipment in storage. Lasers do not teach you anything, Bob said, pressing his eye to the eyepiece. You just read numbers. This you have to think about. You have to understand the geometry. He sighted along the northern edge of the pyramid base, 755 feet of limestone, ancient and weathered but still fundamentally intact. He recorded the angle in his notebook, moved the theodolite, sighted again. The numbers accumulated, each one handwritten, each one the result of human observation and human calculation. After 2 hours, he had enough data. He sat back and did the mathematics. Long division on paper using the slide rule for the logarithms. His hands remembered the motions, even though his eyes needed reading glasses now. The numbers aligned themselves into a conclusion. The northern edge of the Great Pyramid deviated from true north by 3 arc minutes in 6 arc seconds. Bob checked his work, checked it again. The number did not change. 3 arc minutes, 0.067%. He looked up. James was sitting on a block of limestone, watching him with the expression of a man who had already known the answer. 0.067%, Bob said. Yes. Over 755 feet. Yes. Bob set down his slide rule. In 1969, we needed a week and 3 computers to align Launch Complex 39 to within 0.1%. We had theodolites, we had surveying teams, we had engineers with advanced degrees, and we got to 0.1%, and we were proud of it. James said nothing. They did better than us, Bob said slowly, with copper tools and rope. They did better than the United States of America with the full resources of the federal government. Now you are beginning to understand. Bob looked at the pyramid. The morning sun was higher now, harsh and white. The stone absorbed the light and gave back nothing. How James stood brushing dust from his pants. That is the question I have been asking for 45 years. Come, I want to show you something else. They walked along the base of the pyramid. Bob's legs protested. His knees were old, the cartilage worn thin from decades of standing at drafting tables and walking factory floors. He had refused a cane when David offered him one last year. He was regretting that stubbornness now. James led him to the southeastern corner where the original base platform was still partially exposed. The limestone bedrock had been cut and leveled to create the foundation. On top of it, the first course of massive blocks rested with precision joints. Here, James said, kneeling, put your level here. Bob knelt beside him, feeling his knees crack. He placed his spirit level on the bedrock foundation. The bubble floated in its tube, settling exactly between the marks. Perfect level. He moved the level 6 feet to the left. Still level, 6 feet to the right. Level. He stood, walked 20 feet along the base, knelt again. His knees screamed. The level showed perfect horizontal. 13 acres, James said quietly. 500,000 square feet, leveled to within less than 1 inch of variation across the entire surface. Bob did the calculation in his head. Less than 1 inch over 500,000 square feet. That was a tolerance of 0.002%. Modern concrete slabs for commercial buildings were leveled to within 3 inches. State-of-the-art construction could manage 1 inch with laser-guided equipment and careful quality control. This was 4,500 years old. The bedrock is not naturally level, James continued. It is limestone full of fissures and variations. They cut it by hand. They removed the high spots, filled the low spots, and created a platform more level than anything we build today. Bob stood slowly, his vision blurred for a moment, the heat and the exertion catching up to him. James steadied him with a hand on his elbow. I am fine, Bob said. You are 78, James said. Sit, drink water. The pyramid will still be here. They sat in the shade of a tourist shelter, closed now before the day's crowds arrived. James produced a thermos of water and 2 cups. They drank in silence. Bob's mind was working, turning over the problem. Leveling a platform that size required reference points. You could not just eyeball it. You needed some way to establish a horizontal plane across hundreds of feet. Modern construction used water levels, laser levels, sophisticated surveying equipment. Ancient Egypt had none of that. Or did they water, Bob said suddenly. They used water levels. Channels cut in the bedrock filled with water. Water finds its own level. You mark the waterline drain, the channels cut to the marks. James nodded. Almost certainly. We have found evidence of the channels. But even so, the execution is extraordinary. To cut to within 1 inch across 13 acres using water channels and copper tools requires discipline and skill beyond anything we teach today. Bob thought about NASA, the thousands of engineers, the quality control protocols, the constant checking and rechecking. Even with all that infrastructure, they had made mistakes. Apollo 1, the fire that killed 3 astronauts, had been caused by a spark from faulty wiring. Apollo 13, the explosion that nearly killed 3 more, had been caused by a damaged tank. Human error system failure, the price of complexity. The pyramid had no system failures. It had stood for 4,500 years without collapsing, without significant structural damage, without any major engineering faults. We should look at the casing stones, James said, standing. The ones that remain will show you something else. They walked to the northern face where a few of the original Tura limestone casing stones remained at the base, protected by sand and debris from millennia. The rest had been stripped away centuries ago, used to build Cairo. But these few survived, and they were extraordinary. Bob ran his hand along the joint between 2 casing stones. The surface was smooth, polished, the joint so tight he could not see where one block ended and the next began. He pulled a piece of paper from his notebook, tried to slide it into the gap. It would not fit. He tried with the edge of a razor blade from his toolkit. Still would not fit. The tolerances were less than 1/50th of an inch. The blocks weighed 15 tons each. Somehow, ancient workers had positioned 15-ton blocks of limestone with precision measured in thousandths of an inch. In modern construction, Bob said, his voice strange in his own ears, we use cranes, hydraulic jacks, laser alignment systems. We position heavy equipment to within maybe 1/8 of an inch if we are very good. These people did better with rope and muscle. James was quiet, letting Bob process. I do not understand, Bob said finally. I have spent 50 years in engineering. I understand tolerances. I understand what is possible with different levels of technology. This should not be possible. And yet here it is. Here it is, James agreed. They spent the rest of the morning measuring. Bob worked methodically, recording everything in his notebook. The dimensions of this base, the angles of the corners, the alignment to the cardinal directions. Every measurement confirmed what Petrie had found in the 1880s, what countless other surveys had confirmed since. The Great Pyramid was by any measure the most precisely constructed building in ancient history. By noon, the heat was overwhelming. Tourists were arriving in buses swarming around the pyramid with cameras and guides. Bob and James retreated to the research compound for lunch and shade. Bob ate mechanically, not tasting the food. His mind was elsewhere, trying to solve the impossible equation. High precision with primitive tools. Perfect alignment without instruments. Massive scale without mechanization. Every variable said it should not work, but it had worked. The proof was sitting in the desert, untouched by time. His phone buzzed. David texting again. How is it going? Bob typed, confusing. We'll call tonight. The afternoon brought more measurements. James took him to the interior through the entrance, carved into the northern face, down the descending passage into the heart of the pyramid. The passage was narrow, low, cut through solid limestone at an angle of 26 degrees. Bob had to crouch his back, screaming in protest. Tourists shuffled past in the darkness, their flashlights cutting yellow paths through the dust. 345 feet, the passage ran boring through the pyramid and into the bedrock below. The angle never varied. The walls were smooth. At the bottom, it opened into the subterranean chamber, rough and unfinished, carved from the living rock 100 feet below ground level. Bob studied the passage walls. In places, he could see tool marks, the regular patterns left by copper chisels or stone pounders. But the straightness of the passage was what arrested him. Petrie had measured it in the 1880s and found the deviation from a perfect straight line to be less than 1/50th of an inch over the entire length. Bob did the mathematics. 345 feet cut at a precise angle through solid rock, straight to within 1/50th of an inch. That was a tolerance of 0.001%. Modern tunnel boring machines guided by lasers and computers could do that. Barely. Ancient Egyptians working by torchlight in a confined space with copper tools had matched it. "This is impossible," Bob said, and his voice echoed in the chamber. "And yet," James said, they climbed back up Bob's legs, trembling with the effort. The ascending passage was worse steeper, each step a negotiation between will and failing muscle. By the time they reached the Grand Gallery, Bob had to stop and rest. The Grand Gallery opened above them, a soaring corbelled vault, 28 feet high, 153 feet long, angled upward toward the king's chamber. The walls stepped inward in perfect symmetry, each course projecting exactly 3 inches over the one below. The effect was cathedral-like, a space designed to inspire awe. Bob sat on the stone ramp and let his breathing slow. James sat beside him. "When I was 23, Bob said, I stood in the vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center and looked up at the Saturn V rocket. It was 363 feet tall, the most powerful machine ever built. I helped design the stress analysis for the third stage. I understood every rivet, every weld, every structural member. I knew how it worked." He gestured at the Grand Gallery. "I do not know how this works. I do not understand how they built it. And that scares me, James. I am 78 years old. I have degrees from MIT. I worked on the Apollo program, and I am looking at something built 4,500 years ago that I cannot explain." James was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you remember 1974 when I told you I was going to Oxford to study Egyptology? You said the past mattered, and you said only the future mattered, that looking backward was a waste of time." Bob nodded. "I remember." "You were wrong," James said gently. "The past does matter, because the past shows us what we have forgotten. We think we are the pinnacle of human achievement. We think our technology makes us superior to every civilization that came before. But maybe we are just different. Maybe they knew things we have lost." "Knowledge does not get lost," Bob said. "It accumulates. We stand on the shoulders of giants." "But what if the giants came first?" James asked. "What if we are standing on ruins thinking we built the foundation ourselves?" They sat in the darkness of the Grand Gallery, surrounded by 4,500 years of precision engineering, and Bob Mitchell had no answer. The train to Aswan left Cairo at dawn. Bob and James sat in a compartment with cracked vinyl seats and a fan that barely moved the hot air. The journey was 500 miles south, following the Nile through landscape that had not changed in millennia. Green fields along the river, then desert, then fields again. Villages of mud brick, water buffalo standing in irrigation channels, feluccas with white sails drifting on the current. Bob watched it all through the window, his notebook open on his lap, but his pen still. His mind was too full for writing. James dozed across from him, head tilted against the window. They had been traveling together for 2 days now, falling into the rhythms of old friendship, easy silences, comfortable disagreements, the knowledge that they understood each other even when they disagreed. Last night they had sat in James's quarters and talked until midnight. Not about the pyramid, about life, about Margaret, Bob's wife, dead 4 years from cancer that had come fast and merciless, about James's marriage that had ended in divorce 20 years ago, about children and choices and the strange paths that bring a man to 78 years old on a train through Egypt. "I should have visited more," Bob had said. "After Margaret's funeral, I should have stayed in touch." "You were grieving," James had replied. "Grief makes islands of us all." Now the train rattled through the desert, and Bob thought about David, his son, 48 years old and successful in ways Bob did not entirely understand. Finance, investments, money moving through digital networks. David lived in New York in an apartment that cost more than Bob's house in Arlington. He wore suits that cost more than Bob's first car. He was respected, wealthy, accomplished, and he thought his father was wasting his time with pyramids. Bob had called him last night after the conversation with James ended. The call had not gone well. "Dad, you sound exhausted," David had said. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are 78 and you are crawling around inside ancient buildings." "I am measuring. It is what I do." "What you did, past tense. You retired 10 years ago." "Retirement does not mean I stopped being an engineer." David had sighed, a sound of frustration compressed through satellite signals. "What are you trying to prove?" Bob had not had an answer to that question. Or rather, he had too many answers, and none of them would have satisfied his son. The train slowed, stopped at a small station. Vendors appeared at the windows selling fruit and bread and bottles of water. James woke blinking. "Where are we, sir?" "Halfway," Bob said. They bought tea from a vendor strong and sweet in small glass cups. The train lurched forward again. The landscape outside became more arid, the green strip along the river narrower. In the distance, rock formations rose from the sand, ancient and eroded. "Tell me about Aswan," Bob said. "The quarries." James set down his tea. "The granite quarries are about 2 miles from the city. They supplied the red granite for the pyramids at Giza and many other monuments. The ancient workers would cut blocks from the bedrock, transport them to the river, load them onto barges, and float them 500 miles north to Giza. 80-ton blocks," Bob said. "Some of them." "Yes, the beams above the king's chamber, each one weighs between 40 and 80 tons. Bob did the mathematics in his head. 80 tons was 160,000 pounds. A modern shipping container fully loaded weighed about 60,000 pounds. The ancient Egyptians had moved blocks nearly 3 times that weight across 500 miles of river, then lifted them to a height of 140 feet inside the pyramid. "How?" he asked. "That is what we are going to try to understand," James said. Aswan in the afternoon was heat and dust in the blue curve of the Nile. They took a taxi to the quarries, bumping along a road that became dirt and then was barely a road at all. The driver left them at the edge of a vast scar in the earth where red granite bedrock had been cut away in massive steps and shelves. Bob stood at the edge and looked down. The quarry was deep, perhaps 50 feet at its lowest point. The walls showed the marks of ancient tools, regular, parallel grooves where copper chisels or stone pounders had cut into the granite. In places, partially extracted blocks remained frozen in the process of separation from the bedrock. Elena Vasquez was waiting for them near the largest of these unfinished blocks. She was 34, compact and energetic, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that assessed Bob with professional interest. She shook his hand firmly. "Dr. Mitchell, I have read your papers on structural analysis. It is an honor." "Just Bob, please. I am too old for formalities." She smiled. "Then call me Elena. Dr. Whitfield has told me about your work on the Apollo missions. That must have been extraordinary." "It was a long time ago." "Great work does not become less great with time," she said. "Come, I want to show you what we have been attempting." She led them down into the quarry, following a path between blocks of granite that weighed hundreds of tons. At the bottom, a team of workers was gathered around a block of granite the size of a small car. Modern tools lay on the ground: copper saws, copper drills, bags of quartz, sandstone hammers. A generator chugged in the background, powering work lights. "We are attempting to replicate ancient cutting techniques," Elena explained, "using copper tools and quartz sand as an abrasive. The copper does not cut the granite directly. Granite is too hard, but the quartz sand dragged across the surface by the copper will eventually wear through." "Eventually being the key word," said one of the workers, a young Egyptian man with arms like tree trunks. "We have been cutting this same groove for 6 hours, 2 centimeters deep, 20 copper blades destroyed." Bob knelt beside the block. The groove was indeed shallow, barely a scratch in the red granite. He ran his fingers along it. The surface inside the groove was rough, showing the irregular wear of abrasive cutting. 6 hours for 2 centimeters, he said. "How deep does the cut need to be to separate a block?" "A minimum 50 centimeters, Elena said. "On 4 sides plus channels underneath to free it from the bedrock. We estimate 15,000 man-hours per block conservatively." Bob did the calculation. 80-ton block, 15,000 hours. The king's chamber had 9 granite ceiling beams, plus the walls and floor. 60 blocks of granite minimum. 60 times 15,000 was 900,000 man-hours, just for the granite work in one chamber. The pyramid had been built, according to mainstream archaeology, in 20 years. 20 years was 7,300,000 days. 900,000 hours divided by 24 hours per day was 37,500 days. Divided by 20 years was 1,500 days per year. 4 workers per day, every day for 20 years. Just to cut the granite for the king's chamber. Not to transport it, not to shape it, not to polish it, just to make the initial cuts. And that was assuming they worked continuously with no rest days, no illnesses, no tool failures, no mistakes. It does not work, Bob said quietly. Elena nodded. The numbers do not add up. Not if we assume they used only the tools we know they had. Either they worked much faster, which seems impossible, or they had tools we do not know about, or the timeline is wrong. The timeline comes from historical records, James said. Herodotus, Manetho, later sources. All agree the pyramid was built during the reign of Khufu, approximately 20 years. Then they worked faster, Bob said. Somehow. He stood his knees, protesting. The sun was lower now, the light in the quarry turning orange. Shadows stretched across the red stone. Bob looked at the unfinished blocks frozen mid-extraction and tried to imagine the workforce that had labored here 4,500 years ago. Men in linen kilts, skin burned dark by the desert sun. Copper tools that dulled after hours of work and had to be constantly replaced. The rhythmic pounding of stone on stone, the scrape of copper dragged through sand and granite, heat and dust in endless repetition. And somehow they had worked faster than modern workers with modern tools. Show me the drill cores, Bob said. Elena led them to a storage tent at the edge of the quarry. Inside, carefully labeled and cataloged, were samples of ancient work. Pieces of granite with saw marks, sections of limestone with chisel grooves, and several drill core cylinders of stone extracted by ancient drills. Bob picked up one of the cores. It was granite about 6 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. A hole had been drilled through the center, leaving a hollow cylinder. The surface of the core showed spiral grooves, regular and evenly spaced. These grooves had fascinated Flinders Petrie in the 1880s, and they fascinated Bob now. He pulled a magnifying glass from his toolkit and examined the grooves closely. They spiraled around the core at a consistent rate, each groove about 1/10 of an inch below the previous one. That spacing represented the feed rate of the drill, how far it advanced into the stone with each revolution. 1/10 of an inch per revolution. Bob set down the magnifying glass and picked up his notebook. He did the calculation. Modern diamond-tipped drill bits powered by electric drill presses, applying significant pressure, advanced into granite at a rate of about 0.002 inches per revolution. Call it 1/500th of an inch. The ancient drill had advanced 50 times faster, 50 times faster than modern diamond drilling equipment. Bob sat down heavily on a storage crate. His mind was working through the problem, trying to find a solution that made sense. Faster feed rates required more pressure on the drill bit. More pressure meant more force applied from above. The only way to generate that force with ancient technology was weight mass, human or animal muscle. But even if you had 100 men pushing down on a drill shaft, you could not generate enough force to advance through granite at 1/10 of an inch per revolution. The drill would bind or break or skid across the surface, unless the drill was different. Unless it was not a solid bit, but a hollow tube using the abrasive sand to cut a circular groove while leaving a central core. That would reduce the contact area, concentrate the pressure. It might work, but it still would not explain the feed rate. Petrie was baffled by this, James said quietly, standing beside Bob. He measured the same cores. He calculated the same impossible feed rates. He spent years trying to explain it. What was his conclusion? He proposed that the ancient Egyptians had some technique for applying enormous pressure to the drill, perhaps using weighted beams and fulcrums. But he admitted he could not prove it. The mathematics did not quite work. Bob looked at the drill core in his hand, 4,500 years old, proof of capability that should not have existed. When I was 25, he said, I worked on stress analysis for the Apollo 15 lunar module. We had to calculate the maximum load the landing struts could handle on different types of terrain. Rock dust slopes. We used computers, ran simulations, tested scale models. It took months. He held up the drill core. They did not have computers. They did not have simulations. They had stone pounders and copper tubes and twinin, and they drilled faster than we can drill today with diamond bits and electric motors. Yes, James said. I do not understand how. None of us do. They stayed in Aswan that night in a small hotel overlooking the Nile. After dinner, Bob and James sat on the rooftop terrace and watched the river. The water was dark, catching lights from the city and scattering them like stars. Feluccas drifted past their sails, pale triangles against the night. Bob thought about Margaret. She had wanted to visit Egypt. They had planned it for their retirement, a trip to see the pyramids and temples, to drift down the Nile on a boat like those below. But cancer had come first fast and ruthless, and the trip had never happened. You were thinking about her, James said. Bob nodded. She would have loved this, the river, the history. She was a librarian, you know. She loved old things, old books, old stories. I remember. She came to our graduation, took that photograph of us. She kept it on her desk for 50 years, even when I was working too much and neglecting her. Even when I missed David's childhood because I was at Kennedy Space Center or Goddard or wherever the work was. She kept that photograph because she believed I was doing something important. You were. Was I? Bob looked at the river. We went to the moon, we came back, we planted a flag and collected rocks. And now, 50 years later, we cannot even go back. The knowledge, the capability, it is all gone. Lost. We had it and we let it slip away. Knowledge is not lost, James said. It is transformed, passed down in different forms. That is philosophy. I'm talking about practical capability. In 1972, we could send men to the moon. In 2024, we cannot. The rockets are gone, the factories are closed, the engineers who knew how to do it are dead or dying. That is not transformation. That is loss. James was quiet. Then he said, perhaps that is what happened here. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians reached a peak of knowledge and capability, built the Great Pyramid, and then the knowledge was lost. Not because they forgot, but because the conditions that made it possible changed. The organization, the resources, the cultural will. All of it faded. Bob thought about that. The pyramids after Giza were smaller, less precise. The old kingdom had collapsed into chaos. By the time Egypt reunified, they were no longer building pyramids of any significance. The knowledge had existed, had produced the Great Pyramid, and then had vanished. Just like Apollo. I need to tell you something, Bob said, about David. James waited. He thinks this is foolish. My coming here measuring things trying to understand. He wants me to retire properly. Play golf, travel for pleasure, be a grandfather to his son Marcus. He thinks I am chasing ghosts. What do you think? I think I am trying to understand what excellence looks like. Real excellence, the kind that lasts 4,500 years. We built rockets that took us to the moon and back. Extraordinary achievement. But those rockets are gone now, scrapped or rusting in museums. The Great Pyramid is still here. Still standing, still precise. What does that say about our respective civilizations? James smiled in the darkness. It says you are both great in different ways. The Apollo program gave humanity the knowledge that we can leave this planet. That is not nothing, Bob. That is extraordinary. Even if we cannot do it right now, the knowledge that it is possible changes everything. And the pyramid, the pyramid says that human beings with focus and discipline and vision can build forever. That is also extraordinary. They sat in silence watching the river. Somewhere in the city, a call to prayer echoed from a minaret. The sound was ancient and modern at once, unchanged in 14 centuries, broadcast now through electric speakers. Bob pulled out his phone and called David. The connection was better tonight. Dad, David's voice said, how are you? I am in Aswan. We visited the granite quarries today. And I am more confused than ever. But also I am learning something. What? I am learning humility. I spent my career thinking I understood limits. What was possible, what was not. But the evidence does not match my assumptions, which means either the evidence is wrong or my assumptions are wrong. The evidence could be wrong, David said. Interpretations of ancient artifacts, they are always uncertain. The evidence is granite drill cores with measurable feed rates 50 times faster than modern drills. That is not interpretation. That is mathematics. David was silent. I am sorry, Bob said. I know this sounds like I am becoming one of those conspiracy people, ancient aliens or whatever. I am not. I am just trying to reconcile what I know about engineering with what I am seeing here. It is okay, Dad. I worry about you. Mom died 4 years ago and you have been, I do not know, searching for something ever since. Bob closed his eyes. Maybe I am searching for what matters, what lasts. Your mother and I built a life together, raised you. That was our pyramid. And now she is gone and you are grown and I am 78 and wondering what I am leaving behind. You worked on the Apollo program. That is your legacy. Apollo is history. The pyramid is still here. Dad, you are not making sense. I know, I am tired. I will call you tomorrow. After he hung up, James said, he loves you. He is just worried. I know, and he is right to worry. I am 78 years old chasing impossible questions halfway around the world. It is not rational. Rational is overrated, James said. Sometimes you have to follow the mystery. The next day they returned to Cairo by train. Bob slept most of the way, exhausted from the heat and the climbing and the 78 years that made everything harder than it used to be. He dreamed again of the moon, but this time it was different. This time the moon was made of granite red and beautiful, and he was drilling into it with a copper tube while ancient Egyptians in linen kilts watched and shook their heads in disappointment at his slow progress. He woke as the train pulled into Cairo station. James was reading a book, glasses perched on his nose. Bob sat up disoriented. Bad dream, James asked. Strange dream. They returned to the Giza compound in the evening. The pyramids were dark shapes against the sunset, black on orange. Bob felt the weight of them, the sheer mass of stone, the impossible precision. Every measurement he had taken only deepened the mystery. That night, alone in his quarters, Bob reviewed his notes. Pages and pages of measurements, all confirming what Petrie and others had found. The Great Pyramid was built to tolerances that modern construction rarely achieved. The base was level to within an inch, over 13 acres. The alignment to true north was accurate to within 0.067%. The faces were slightly concave, creating an 8-sided structure visible only from the air. The interior passages were straight to within fractions of an inch over hundreds of feet. Each fact alone was impressive. Together they formed a pattern that defied conventional explanation. Bob set down his notebook and picked up his phone. He scrolled through his photos until he found one from 1969. The Apollo 11 launch, Saturn V rising on a pillar of flame. Bob was somewhere in that crowd of engineers watching the greatest machine ever built climb toward orbit. They had done the impossible then, looked at the moon and decided to go there, and then actually went, with slide rules and determination and refusal to accept limitations. The ancient Egyptians had looked at a plateau of rough limestone and decided to build perfection, and then actually built it, with copper tools and determination and refusal to accept limitations. Were they so different? Bob called David one more time. Dad, it is late there. I know, I need to tell you something. What? I was wrong about your career when you chose finance instead of engineering. I was disappointed. I thought you were wasting your potential. Dad, we have been over this. Let me finish. I was wrong because I thought legacy was about building things, physical things, rockets, buildings, machines. But maybe legacy is about understanding, about passing knowledge forward. You understand systems, David. Money markets, how the world actually works. That is valuable. That matters. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, where is this coming from? From standing in front of something I do not understand. From realizing that the people who built this knew things I will never know. And that is okay. That is humbling, but it is okay. Because knowledge continues. It transforms. Your son Marcus, he is 12 now. Yes. Bring him to Egypt before I am too old to climb stairs. Let me show him what human beings can achieve when they focus, when they refuse to accept limits. Dad, that would be expensive. I will pay for it. I am 78. I do not need the money. I need to pass something forward. Another silence. Then David said, let me talk to him, to Marcus, see if he is interested. Thank you, son. Dad, I love you. I love you too. Bob ended the call and sat in the darkness of his quarters. Outside the pyramids waited patient and eternal. Tomorrow James wanted to show him something, something not in the official records, something about voids and hidden chambers. Bob was ready. Whatever mysteries remained, he would face them. He was 78 years old, but he was not dead yet. And the Great Pyramid had secrets it was finally willing to share. James came to Bob's quarters at midnight. Are you awake? Bob was sitting at his desk reviewing calculations by lamplight. His reading glasses reflected the yellow glow. I have not been sleeping well. Good, get dressed. Warm clothes, we are going somewhere. Where inside, they walked across the compound in darkness. Security lights cast long shadows. The pyramids were invisible against the night sky, but Bob could feel them massive presences that bent the world around them. James led him to a storage building, unlocked it with a key that should not have existed, and pulled out equipment. Rope flashlights, a small video camera, an endoscopic probe with a monitor. "This is not official," Bob said. "Oh, no. We could get arrested." "Possibly." James, that I am 78 years old. Egyptian prisons do not have good medical care. James smiled in the flashlight beam. "Then we better not get caught." They approached the pyramid from the north side, away from the tourist entrance. James knew every stone, every crack, every shadow. He led Bob to what looked like a minor irregularity in the facing, but when he pried at it with a crowbar, a section of limestone shifted, revealing a narrow gap. "Tomb robbers made this probably 2,000 years ago," James whispered. "It has been sealed and unsealed many times. Right now, it is unsealed. Tomorrow, maybe it will be sealed again. But tonight, we go in." Bob looked at the gap. It was perhaps 18 inches wide, angling upward into darkness. "I cannot fit through that." "You can. You will just hate it." James went first, sliding into the gap with the ease of long practice. Bob heard him moving up the passage, stones scraping. Then his voice distant and echoing. "Come on, Bobby. You climbed into lunar module simulator smaller than this." Bob took a breath and followed. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, the weight of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. He had to exhale to squeeze through some sections. His shoulders scraped against rough limestone. The angle was steep, and he had to crawl, pulling himself forward with his hands while his knees screamed protest. He was too old for this, way too old. But he kept moving because the alternative was backing out and admitting defeat, and Robert Mitchell had not backed down from a challenge in 78 years. He was not starting now. The passage opened into a larger space. Bob pulled himself through the final constriction and found himself in a roughly hewn chamber, perhaps 10 feet on a side. James's flashlight illuminated limestone walls, chisel marks, dust thick on the floor. "Where are we?" "Between the outer casing and the core blocks. This space should not exist according to the official plans. But tomb robbers found it centuries ago, probably looking for hidden treasure chambers." James crossed to the far wall and pointed his light at a section of stone that looked no different from any other. "Here, this was sealed until 3 weeks ago. I opened it with Elena's help. Officially, it does not exist. Unofficially, it leads to the void. The Muon scan void from 2017. Yes." Bob's heart was beating fast, and not just from the climb. "You told me that was still unexplored." "Officially, it is. The Egyptian government does not want to damage the pyramid, so they wait debate form committees. Meanwhile, Elena and I found another way in." James pulled away the loose stones, revealing a hole about 2 feet in diameter. He shone his light through it. The beam disappeared into emptiness, showing nothing but air and darkness. "How big is the void?" "According to the Muon scans, at least 100 feet long, maybe 30 feet high. It sits above the Grand Gallery in a space where there should only be solid stone." Bob knelt beside the hole, his joints protesting. He looked into the darkness and felt a thrill he had not felt since he was young. Discovery, the unknown. This was why he had become an engineer, to push into spaces where no one had gone before. "Can we get in?" James pulled out the endoscopic probe. "Not physically, not without major excavation. But we can see. Elena and I sent this probe through 3 weeks ago. We recorded everything. I want to show you." He connected the probe to the monitor and carefully fed the cable through the hole. The monitor flickered to life, showing grainy images of stone and darkness. James maneuvered the probe, and the camera angle changed, sweeping across what appeared to be a large chamber. Bob leaned close to the monitor. The image quality was poor, but he could make out regular patterns on the walls. Not hieroglyphs, not the religious texts you would expect in a tomb. These were geometric shapes, lines and angles and curves arranged in systematic patterns. "What is that?" Bob whispered. "We think they are diagrams, engineering diagrams." The probe moved slowly across the wall. Bob saw what looked like circular patterns, concentric rings with radiating lines. Star maps, possibly. Then rectangular grids with markings that could have been measurements or calculations. Then more complex patterns that Bob's engineer brain recognized as structural diagrams showing forces and loads and stress distributions. My God, he said softly. James zoomed in on one section. The markings were in red ochre, faded but still visible. Bob recognized the patterns. They were showing angles, ratios, mathematical relationships. The same relationships he had found encoded in the pyramid's dimensions. Pi, the golden ratio, the proportions of circles and squares. This is a textbook, Bob said. They built a textbook into the pyramid. That is what we think. Knowledge preserved in stone. Mathematical principles, astronomical calculations, structural engineering. All of it carved into a hidden chamber where it could survive millennia. The probe continued its sweep. More diagrams, more calculations. Then something that made Bob catch his breath. A drawing of what looked like the pyramid itself but shown in cross-section with internal passages marked. And in the passages, symbols that might have been numbers or measurements. They documented their own construction, James said. They left instructions for how they did it. Bob stared at the monitor. His hands were shaking. This was the answer to the question that had consumed him for weeks. Not just how they built the pyramid, but that they knew how, that they understood what they were doing, that they deliberately encoded that knowledge for whoever came after. They were not primitives stumbling toward achievement. They were engineers, sophisticated and deliberate, who understood that knowledge must be preserved. The probe moved to another wall. More star charts, these ones showing constellations Bob recognized. Orion prominent and detailed. The Big Dipper. Other patterns he did not immediately identify. And among the stars, calculations. Numbers in a base 10 system showing ratios and proportions. Precession calculations, James said, pointing to the monitor. They track the precession of the equinoxes. That is a 25,000-year cycle. They observed it, measured it, calculated it, and they carved it here in a chamber sealed 4,500 years ago. Bob sat back on his heels. The chamber around him was close and dusty, the air stale, but his mind was racing, connecting pieces. The pyramid's dimensions encoded the size of the earth. The chamber positions encoded mathematical constants. The hidden void contained the knowledge that made it all possible. It was all one system, one integrated design, a structure that was simultaneously a tomb, a temple, a monument, and a library. Knowledge made physical, rendered in stone, that would outlast any book, any scroll, any digital archive. We cannot do this, Bob said quietly. James looked at him. Cannot do what? This, build knowledge that lasts forever. We build databases that become obsolete in 20 years. We put everything on the internet, which requires constant power and maintenance. If civilization fell tomorrow, how much of our knowledge would survive? Some libraries, books. Books rot, paper decays, digital storage corrupts. In 5,000 years, what will remain of the 21st century? What will archaeologists dig up and say, yes, they knew things worth preserving? James was silent. They understood, Bob continued, the people who built this. They understood that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations fall, that if you want something to last, you carve it in granite and hide it inside a mountain of stone that nothing can destroy. The probe swept across another wall. This one showed what looked like mechanical diagrams. Levers, perhaps, pulleys, systems for multiplying force. Bob recognized the principles, the same physics he had used to calculate stress loads on Saturn V components. Ancient engineers applying the same mathematics to move 80-ton blocks of granite. Show me the rest, he said. They spent 3 hours reviewing the footage Elena and James had captured. 3 hours of geometric patterns and star charts and structural diagrams. Bob's engineer mind absorbed it all, filing away details, making connections. By the time they finished, he had filled 20 pages in his notebook with sketches and calculations. We need to publish this, Bob said. This changes everything. James shook his head. If we publish, the Egyptian government will seal it permanently. It was accessed without authorization. Elena and I could lose our credentials, possibly face criminal charges. And they will close the entrance, concrete it over. Make sure no one can see it again. But the knowledge will still be there, waiting. The pyramid has kept secrets for 4,500 years. It can keep them a little longer until the time is right. Bob wanted to argue, but he understood. James and Elena had risked their careers to show him this. Demanding they risk more would be selfish. Then what do? We finish your assessment. You write your report carefully. You say the pyramid demonstrates extraordinary engineering capability. You note anomalies that require further study. You recommend continued research with proper authorization and oversight. And privately, you and I know what is really here. They climb back down the narrow passage, Bob going first this time, sliding down the steep angle with his back against the stone. His shirt tore. His hands scraped raw. He did not care. He had seen something that perhaps 50 people in the modern era had seen. Knowledge hidden in stone waiting for humanity to be ready for it. They emerged into the night air, gasping and covered in dust. James sealed the entrance behind them, placing stones so carefully that no one would know they had been disturbed. They walked back to the compound in silence. Two old men who had just crawled through a passage meant for younger bodies. Bob's phone buzzed. A text from David Marcus says yes, he wants to come to Egypt. When Bob smiled in the darkness, soon he typed. Very soon. In his quarters, Bob showered and changed into clean clothes. His body ached in places he had forgotten existed. He would pay for tonight's adventure tomorrow. But it had been worth it. He sat at his desk and began writing his report. Careful, measured language. No speculation about ancient knowledge or hidden chambers. Just measurements, observations, conclusions drawn from evidence. The Great Pyramid of Giza represents an extraordinary achievement in precision engineering. Base leveling accurate to within 1 inch over 13 acres. Alignment to true north within 0.067%. Interior passages straight to within 1/50th of an inch over hundreds of feet. Stone joints fitted to tolerances of less than 1/50th of an inch. These measurements are verifiable and repeatable. They demonstrate capability that meets or exceeds modern construction standards. The methods by which these tolerances were achieved remain incompletely understood. Experimental archaeology has shown that proposed ancient techniques can produce similar results, but the scale and speed of execution required by the timeline remain problematic. Recommendation: the Great Pyramid should be regarded as evidence of sophisticated engineering knowledge in ancient Egypt. Further research is warranted with particular attention to recently discovered voids and chambers that may contain additional information about construction methods. He wrote for hours until the sky outside began to lighten. The report was technical, careful, defensive. It said enough to be honest, but not enough to invite controversy. It was the report of a 78-year-old engineer who had learned finally the value of humility. When he finished, he sent a copy to James and another to the Smithsonian. Then he called David, even though it was the middle of the night in New York. Dad, what is wrong? Nothing is wrong. I finished my report. I am ready to come home. You sound different. I am different. I learned something here, David, about excellence, about legacy, about what matters. What did you learn? Bob looked out the window. The sun was rising, turning the pyramids gold. I learned that great work transcends time. The people who built this, they are dead 4,500 years, but their work remains, perfect and eternal. We went to the moon and that was great, but we came back and now we can barely remember how we did it. They built this to last forever, and it has. David was quiet. Then he said, when can I bring Marcus? Give me 2 weeks to rest, then come. I want to show him what human beings can do when they refuse to accept limits. Okay, Dad, we will come. After the call, Bob packed his equipment. The theodolite went into its case, the slide rule into its sleeve. His notebooks filled with measurements that confirmed what Petrie had found 140 years ago. What other surveyors would find 100 years from now? The pyramid did not change, only the questions people brought to it. James came to his quarters at noon. You are leaving. In a few days, I need to rest first. I am not 22 anymore. None of us are. James sat in the desk chair. What will you do when you get home? Teach my grandson, pass something forward. Make sure he understands that excellence is not about having the best tools. It is about refusing to compromise, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard. You sound like an old man giving a final lecture. Bob smiled. I am an old man, and this might be my final lecture. But that is okay. I made it to 78. I worked on Apollo. I measured the Great Pyramid. I have no complaints. They sat in comfortable silence. Outside, tourists were arriving in buses, cameras ready. They would take photographs and check off a bucket list and leave thinking they understood. But they would not understand. Not really. Understanding required measurement, observation, time spent with the stones until they began to speak. The void, Bob said. The diagrams in there. Someone should study them properly, with authorization, with resources. Someone will, when the time is right. How will we know when the time is right? James smiled. When humanity is ready to learn from the past instead of dismissing it, when we stop thinking we are the pinnacle of everything and start understanding we are just one step in a very long journey. Bob thought about that. Apollo had been a pinnacle, the height of human technological achievement, and then it ended and the capability faded. The pyramids had been a pinnacle too, and then the old kingdom fell and the knowledge was lost. But the pyramid remained, the knowledge in the void remained, waiting for someone to find it, to understand it, to carry it forward. I need to tell you something, Bob said, about why I really came here. James waited. Margaret, before she died, she said something. She said I had spent my whole life building temporary things, rockets that burned up in the atmosphere, satellites that fall from orbit, projects that get canceled. She said I should find something permanent, something that would outlast me. And I think I found it, not something I built, something I understood. The pyramid is permanent. The knowledge is permanent. Even if civilizations fall, even if languages die, even if everything we think we know becomes forgotten, the stones will remain. The mathematics will remain. Future generations, whoever they are, will be able to stand here and measure and learn. James nodded slowly. That is a good legacy, better than most. I want my grandson to understand that. I want him to know that excellence is not about being first or fastest or most powerful. It is about doing work that lasts, work that matters. Then teach him. 2 weeks later, Bob sat in his workshop in Arlington and waited. His flight from Cairo had been long and exhausting. He had slept for 16 hours after arriving home. Now his body was adjusting back to American time, his mind still half in Egypt, still seeing geometric patterns on hidden walls. The doorbell rang. Bob stood slowly, his body reminding him that climbing through ancient passages had consequences. He opened the door. David stood there, 48 years old, wearing jeans and a casual shirt instead of his usual suit. Beside him was Marcus, 12 years old, tall and thin, with curious eyes. "Grandpa," Marcus said. Bob hugged him. The boy was almost as tall as Bob now, growing up too fast like children do. "Come in, I want to show you something." In the workshop, Bob had set up his theodolite on the bench. Beside it, his notebooks from Egypt opened to pages of measurements and sketches. And on the wall, a new photograph, the Great Pyramid at sunrise, massive and golden. "This is what I wanted you to see," Bob said to Marcus. "Not just the pyramid, but what it represents." Marcus looked at the photograph, the instruments, the notebooks. "What does it represent?" "Excellence. Real excellence. The kind that lasts 4,500 years. Bob spent the next hour showing Marcus how to use the theodolite, how to measure angles and calculate distances. The boy was attentive, asking good questions. David watched from the doorway, smiling. "Your grandfather tells me you want to study engineering," David said. "Maybe," Marcus said. "I am not sure yet." "That is okay," Bob said. "You have time. But let me tell you something. Engineering is not about building things, not really. It is about understanding how things work, about refusing to accept that something is impossible until you have measured it, calculated it, proven it, about maintaining standards even when it is hard. Like the pyramid. Exactly like the pyramid. The people who built that, they refused to accept anything less than perfection. Every block had to fit exactly. Every measurement had to be precise. Every angle had to be right. They could have done it faster, easier, with less precision, but they did not. They built it to last forever, and it has. Marcus ran his hand along the theodolite. "Can I really go to Egypt? See it myself?" "We all can," David said. "If Grandpa is willing to go again." Bob looked at his son. "I would like that. One more trip, while I still can." They planned it for the spring, 6 months away. Bob would rest, build his strength back up. Marcus would finish the school year. David would arrange time off work. And then they would go 3 generations to stand before the Great Pyramid and measure and learn. The months passed. Bob worked in his workshop teaching Marcus on weekends. They built a scale model of the pyramid, calculating the proportions, understanding the geometry. David joined them, sometimes asking questions, beginning to understand what his father had spent a lifetime pursuing. In January, Bob woke one morning feeling strange. His chest was tight, his breathing shallow. He called David, who called an ambulance. The hospital ran tests. Heart failure, they said. Not acute, but progressive. He had months, maybe a year. "I want to go to Egypt," Bob told David in the hospital room. "One more time." "Dad, you are not strong enough." "I am strong enough for one more trip, please. I need Marcus to see it. I need to pass this forward." David looked at his father, 78 years old, hooked to monitors and oxygen. Then he nodded. "Okay, we will go, as soon as you are cleared to travel." Bob smiled. "Thank you, son." But he did not get cleared to travel. The heart failure progressed faster than expected. By March, he was confined to bed. Marcus visited every day after school, sitting with his grandfather, listening to stories about the moon and the pyramids and what it meant to build something that mattered. "I am sorry," Bob said one afternoon. "I wanted to show you Egypt." "It is okay, Grandpa. You showed me something better." "What?" "You showed me that work matters, that doing things right matters, that just because something is hard does not mean you give up." Bob squeezed his grandson's hand. "Good. That is the important thing. The pyramid will still be there when you are older. You will go someday. And when you do, you will measure it. You will see the precision. And you will understand that the people who built it were just like us, human, mortal. But they did work that transcended mortality." "I will go," Marcus promised, "and I will measure it, just like you taught me." Robert Mitchell died peacefully on a Tuesday in January, with David and Marcus beside him. His last words were about measurements, about tolerances, about the importance of getting things right. His last thoughts were of granite drill cores and limestone casing stones, and the way the pyramid looked at sunrise, eternal and perfect. They buried him in Arlington with full honors. Former colleagues from NASA attended, old men and women who had worked on Apollo, who remembered when Bob Mitchell was young and brilliant and helped send humans to the moon. David gave the eulogy, speaking about his father's dedication, his precision, his refusal to compromise. Marcus did not speak at the funeral, but he stood beside the grave and held the theodolite his grandfather had used at Giza. And he made a promise to himself that someday he would return to Egypt. He would stand before the Great Pyramid. He would measure it with the same instrument his grandfather had used, and he would understand. 6 months after Bob's death, a package arrived at David's office. It was from James Whitfield in Cairo. Inside was a photograph of the Great Pyramid and a letter written in careful handwriting. "David, your father was a great man. He came to Egypt as a skeptic and left as a believer. Not in aliens or mysticism, but in human capability. In the possibility that our ancestors knew things we have forgotten. In the importance of preserving knowledge for future generations. I wanted you to know that the Egyptian government has authorized new exploration of the void your father saw, properly, officially, with international oversight. When they enter it, when they study the diagrams and calculations on those walls, his contribution will be noted. His measurements, his report, his insistence on rigorous assessment helped make this possible. He did important work here, work that will matter long after all of us are gone. I have enclosed something else. The notebook Bob kept during his last visit. He forgot it in his quarters when he left. I thought Marcus might want it." With respect and friendship, James David opened the notebook. Page after page of measurements, sketches, calculations in his father's precise engineer's handwriting. And on the last page, a note for Marcus. "When you are ready, go to Egypt. Measure the pyramid. Understand what human beings can achieve when they refuse to accept limits. This is your legacy. Make me proud." David gave the notebook to Marcus that evening. The boy opened it carefully, reverently, and began to read. And as he read, he smiled, because he understood finally what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. Excellence was not about having the best tools or the newest technology. It was about standards, about refusing to compromise, about doing work that would last, that would matter, that would transcend the brief span of a human life. The Great Pyramid had stood for 4,500 years. It would stand for 4,500 more. And every generation that came to it, every engineer who measured it, every person who stood before it in wonder, would learn the same lesson. We are mortal, but our work, if we do it right, if we refuse to accept anything less than our best, can be eternal. Marcus closed the notebook and looked out the window toward the sky. Somewhere out there, the moon hung in space, visited once by his grandfather's generation, and then abandoned. Somewhere else in the desert beside the Nile, the Great Pyramid waited patient and eternal. He would go there someday. He would measure it. He would understand. That was his promise to his grandfather. That was his inheritance. And the pyramid would still be there waiting to teach him what it had taught every generation for 4 millennia. That human beings, despite their limitations, despite their mortality, despite having only primitive tools and human muscle, could build perfection. They just had to care enough. They just had to refuse to compromise. They just had to understand that excellence is not a destination, but a standard. A standard that transcends time, transcends technology, transcends the brief lives of the individuals who pursue it. The pyramid knew this. Bob Mitchell had learned it, and now Marcus would carry it forward. The last measurement had been taken. The last lesson had been taught. And the Great Pyramid stood in the desert golden in the Egyptian sun, keeping its secrets, waiting for the next generation to come seeking answers. Waiting as it had waited for 4,500 years, patient and perfect and eternal. Human hands had built it. Human knowledge had designed it. Human will had made it real. And that, more than any mystery, more than any impossible precision, was the true wonder of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It proved that we, despite everything, are capable of greatness. We just have to care enough to achieve it.